Next up, I have the pleasure of bringing to the stage some of my absolute favorite thought leaders on this topic. All three of our next panelists are members of our newly announced BPC Advisory Council on Climate and Trade. Our moderator is BPC's own John Jacobs. Please welcome to the stage Dave Banks, who we've already seen earlier, Jane Flegal, who's at Stripe Climate and formerly White House CEQ on industrial policy, and Maureen Hinman, co-founder and chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator.
All right. Thank you, Zan. I've been waiting for this panel because this is the wonky panel. This is when we get into policy details, really flesh out what a lot of people have been talking about with the Clean Competition Act and the Foreign Pollution Fee Act. And we have a group of panelists that are not only incredibly smart on this issue, but also big personalities. So I think it'll be a fun panel of going back and forth. And I'm just going to try to set them up and try to get out of the way of their hot takes. So we just heard from Senator Cassidy and Senator Whitehouse. We now have two visions, a Democrat vision and a Republican vision in the Clean Competition Act and the Foreign Pollution Fee Act. And BPC's new report that you should all have really compares these bills and some other options when it comes to policy design details. And luckily, we have one of the authors sitting right here. So Dave, can you walk us through how these two bills converge, but also what are the pinch points that we need to be thinking about in building a bipartisan coalition?
Well, of course, I'm going to plug the paper again after you, because it does spend a lot of time looking at the differences between the two current versions of the bills. Look, I think that, look, this is kind of the first round of legislation. Right, I don't think any of us actually think that one of these bills is going to become law. That's okay, because I think getting the conversation moving, it was incredibly important to the overall effort in developing this relatively new policy. So what I would kind of like to do, not to shake it up too much, but kind of look at the current versions and try to forecast where I think things will land, right? And I do think that over time, you're going to have more similarities than what you currently see. I know that Zan and the senators talked about the absence or the presence of a fee on less efficient domestic producers. That's obviously the biggest difference right now. And look, I think that for Senator Cassidy and his approach, it does represent a red line for Republicans. You're not going to have any kind of Republican support for imposing a fee on domestic producers. Again, I think that from a Republican point of view, this is all about geopolitics. It's about commercial interests for the U.S. And it's, I think it also is part of this whole conversation related to a domestic carbon tax, which Republicans largely oppose. So, but look, with the similarities, I think over time, some of these differences, and let's say, look, two of the big differences now, one is related to sort of covered goods, and the other one is focused on international partnerships. Now, I will say this, as we kind of move forward, just the pure politics of this, I think for a lot of affected industry, or potentially affected industry, they've kind of looked at this and gone, okay, neither one of these are going to really move forward at this point, but what do we like, what do we not like? Well, first of all, you can't cover industries that don't want to be covered. That is, that's just not going to work politically. And then, the question is, what industries are going to want to be covered? Well, there's a similar thread here in that the industries that want to be covered, like steel, aluminum, cement, a lot of those industries have been decimated by the trade regime. And they see a U.S. CBAM design as a lifeline. Okay, but this also, and by the way, from the Republican perspective, again, our goal is our chief goal, look, it's all good to reduce global emissions, of course, but our chief goal is to increase U.S. competitiveness, right? And try to rein in control of the global supply chains that China currently enjoys, right? And so, we want to make sure that the industries that we cover are the ones that want to be covered, right? If we have an industry or a segment of U.S. industry goes, we don't need your help in protecting or promoting our commercial interests, okay, give them the pass. But I think that this will affect kind of how we view the ultimate policy design. So it may be a much more narrow sectoral approach initially. But then this feeds into the international partnerships piece, right? Because I know a lot of folks have an interest in international partnerships, but look, I think for the affected industry that has been decimated by the trade regime, they're looking at this and going, okay, we want to monetize our carbon advantage. We don't want all these exit ramps and all these opportunities to create international partnerships with Vietnam and these emerging economies and developing countries that where China could just offshore and relocate its industry. So I just so I don't know what the future of these international partnerships is going to look like, because I think from the Republican perspective, and a bellwether here would be where the steel industry is. Right? If the steel industry says, we don't like this, right? We don't want all these off-ramps and potential partnerships, I think the Republicans are going to say, okay. And ultimately, Republicans will support the steel industry and workers. And one quick thing, now there's this potential exception, and that would be with low-carbon technologies that acknowledge that because of the supply chain requirements, there is a need for international partnerships, right? Because we can't reshore everything. So there could be kind of differences among the sectors.
Maureen, a lot of what Dave just highlighted where the bills converge really align with what Silverado published as what should be the main objectives of a climate and trade bill. So leveraging the US carbon advantage, securing supply chains, building international partnerships. What do you see this as the magic sauce for building a bipartisan coalition?
First of all, congrats on the report. It's excellent. It's always, from our perspective, really comforting when we see another major think tank put out a report and we kind of are in rough alignment. It makes us feel like we've done our homework and maybe you've done yours too, so congrats. So I think there's kind of like three big buckets on this issue. First of all, just you need a policy that's technically practicable, right? There's a lot of things one could do, but it needs to be something that businesses can do that will not increase their compliance costs. We've heard a lot about compliance costs today and the burden on U.S. businesses, and U.S. businesses will comply. A lot of their rub with their domestic competition, as Senator Cassidy had mentioned, with the import competition in their domestic market, is that they have very high compliance costs. They play by the rules, and often even in their own market, they're facing competition that does not have that same burden. And then, of course, having measures in place that make sure that it is transparent, that your calculation system is universal and comparable, and that you avoid circumvention and cheating. You have measures in place to make sure cheaters pay. And then the second area is really just avoiding manufacturing taxes on U.S. businesses prior to leveling the playing field, especially vis-a-vis U.S. businesses and strategic polluters like China and non-market economies like China, wherever their sort of facilities may be domiciled, right? I think we've heard that point that these facilities can move around, and so I really think that this is a test to the U.S. government's ability to actually do something effective after many years of sort of trade battery with trade policy, and for businesses to actually reestablish some of their trust with the U.S. government's ability to protect them in a growing global market. I think after you do that, you have that's really plays to this sort of political viability. After you do that, I think that the idea of a carbon tax becomes a lot more palatable if businesses feel comfortable that whatever they have to pay, their competitors overseas are also going to have to pay for. And then that leads to the third is just really creating incentives for international partnerships, right? And so the idea is that you would have a system or a club that others actually want to join. And this is an issue where the US actually has a real advantage because as it stands, the CBAM is a punitive measure, right? It says you will do this type of policy or we will slam you with a bunch of taxes. And it doesn't really incentivize decarbonization in the manufacturing markets. And so the second sort of layer of political viability is really not just about domestic political viability, but international political viability. And that really comes from forming plans and measures that are going to incentivize the US way of doing things as opposed to an EU way of doing things, or worse, a China way of doing things. So hoping that we kind of are thinking sort of strategically on those two levels of political viability.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of this conversation is really about industrial practices. I mean, that's what it boils down to. And Jane, you used to work on industrial decarbonization at the White House. Can you walk us through how a climate and trade bill touches industrial decarb, but also the way that international partnerships play into global industrial decarb?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. We've already heard today, not only from Brian Deese, but from the policymakers and senators who engaged today, about the ways in which industrial decarbonization, which is fundamentally about reinvesting in and reinvigorating and cleaning up our manufacturing base, is an incredible opportunity, not just for the climate, but importantly for the economy and for our national security. And now I'm going to say something that most industrial decarbonization experts no longer want me to say, which is that it also is kind of uniquely challenging. And it's certainly uniquely challenging relative to other sectors of the economy that we need to decarbonize to limit the risks of climate change. And that is because, unlike, for example, electricity, these are highly price-sensitive, trade-exposed commodities. And so while we talked in the Biden administration, and they continue to talk about the need to use a whole-of-government approach to tackle some of our major challenges, there's nowhere that is more true than when it comes to industrial decarbonization. There is no single policy that is going to be sort of a panacea for addressing these really important and interrelated challenges and capturing the opportunity. So I would posit that leveraging the tools of trade and leveraging market access is not just advisable for accelerating industrial decarbonization, it is actually unavoidable. And that's true both for accelerating domestic decarbonization and global decarbonization. And I want to just call out two things. I think there are two climate-related objectives of better linking climate and trade in these kinds of ways that are worth calling out because they sometimes get lumped together. One is there is a carbon loophole today in the world. Like half of our industrial pollution problem is the result of unfair trade practices, full stop. We have to address that problem. Secondarily, and in some ways at least as important, we need to catalyze further decarbonization and emissions reductions. But there are two problems here that we are trying to solve simultaneously. And maybe one other sort of philosophical point before we say a few specific things, which is, there's been a lot of conversation about the role of existing international institutions, whether it's the WTO or the UNFCCC. And I actually think we're at a really exhilarating time to be talking about climate and trade, because I think there's a growing recognition that these institutions are in fact human artifacts and that they are instrumental to achieving objectives. They are not inherently good in and of themselves, actually. And if they are not working and to solve our most pressing challenges, we have not only the opportunity, but the responsibility to change them and or to work around them. Just a couple of things I want to highlight quickly about the way these border adjustments might be designed to maximize their climate impact. First, this has already been mentioned in the category of accelerating more domestic decarbonization. Much has been made already about the ways that, especially if we cooperate with other countries, we can capture growing market access for clean American industries. And that is, a world where that is true is much better than a world where that is not true, both for the climate and the economy. The second is there actually is an incentive, or could be, depending on how such a tool is designed, for concentrated industries in the US who would be subject to these regimes to reduce their emissions more aggressively to, for example, reduce the national standard, whatever it might be that we are applying to foreign entities, to capture more market share. Third, there is this possibility of such a thing potentially applying domestically. And then fourth, also, we talked about a border adjustment potentially being a generator of revenue. It's entirely plausible to imagine using some of that revenue to bolster the already very exciting investments in both the IRA and the bipartisan infrastructure law in industrial decarbonization domestically. I will stop there.
Well, that's great, and I want to start getting into the weeds a little bit more into some specific issues. So maybe do a bit of a hot round here. We've heard a lot about how to incorporate least developed economies. We just heard the senators talking about it. Jane, you just talked about our current paradigm, how we essentially incentivize reshoring emissions to least developed economies. How can we think about incorporating them, Maureen, how can we think about incorporating them into a climate and trade package and prevent loopholes that would incentivize players like China to reshore to those countries?
Thanks for the question. I mean, this is the essential tension. How do you deal sort of with legitimate developing countries and their legitimate interests versus a very large industrialized country with a lot of capacity who is in many cases the #1 producer of environmental technology in the world, raising its hand and saying, I'm a developing country, I should get to do this, that, and the other. So I think the first is, and as the senator mentioned, was, start with income groupings. Don't let countries self-identify, but then really look at those countries' capacity to perform. Not just how they're performing, but what is their capacity? What do they make? What do their best in service businesses do? And what are they capable of? And so what you do second with developing countries is you freeze their performance in time. You say, look, everything that you will produce in this country here forward, every facility you build will be at this level, unless the investor is from a higher capacity country. Then those facilities have to be at the level of that country's capacity, not the developing country. This is really valuable, first because it closes that loophole for circumvention, but it also goes a long way to facilitating a thing that developing countries have been very frustrated at in UNFCCC and other negotiations, is that they want tech transfer, they want the technology, they want the expertise, and they want the dollars. And so by kind of incentivizing investment dollars around capacity, you're able to give some of that tech transfer. And then third, and this is relevant to the CBAM and other issues, is just don't steal from poor countries, right? The current CBAM is in a position the EU CBAM is in a position to basically tax developing countries, many of whom were former colonies, for the infrastructure that the colonial powers put in place, profited from, and then left, right? The decommissioning costs, the cost for operations, these facilities get older, they get dirtier, right? And so imagine how you would feel if you were trying to decommission a coal-fired power plant and you were told, good news, I'm gonna start taxing you on that plant that I put in place. It's very frustrating. That anger is really real, and I visit the WTO a lot, and the developing countries are very mad. So I always think that the best way to kind of think about these trade policies is like, okay, what if we did the opposite, right? What if America did the opposite? We flipped it on its head. So we let them keep their revenue, as long as they agree to use what they would have spent on that revenue towards environmental purposes, right? Let them have their money, let them invest in their own economies, and also require that when they do those investments, they're buying U.S. technology, right? So now you're promoting U.S. clean tech exports. You can also imagine sort of building in some linkages into things that we care about around critical minerals and supply chains. And then the final thing is that on developing countries is that you really need a system of fungibility around carbon credits, right? Much of the value that developing countries have is in really efficient carbon storage, right? And so having the fungibility of credits, let those countries and also other countries avoid paying taxes by sequestering carbon wherever it's the most efficient, by building that backbone of a system. As I often say, carbon credits don't have any feelings. They don't actually care where they're sequestered.
I think that perfectly tees up my next question. Which, Jane, you spend a ton of time thinking about carbon dioxide removal nowadays. We heard from Congressman Peters about the importance of CDR. How should we think about incorporating CDR and carbon credits? What are the pitfalls to avoid, but like, what are the benefits we can get out of this?
I think it's a really important question, and I guess there's three mechanisms I can think of. One is the one I think most people think of, which is essentially basically offsetting your emissions in lieu of paying the fee by investing in a carbon removal project elsewhere. I think that is something that should be examined carefully and could be a potential opportunity for sure. It is very important to get the rules right around this. The thing that you are doing in lieu of reducing a pulse of fossil fuel emissions needs to be equivalent to that pulse of fossil fuel emissions. So it has to be a permanent carbon removal, which tends to be a much more expensive carbon removal. So it is not the same, it doesn't play the same kind of cost containment role that conventional carbon credits often sometimes are thought to have played, and that's very important for the integrity of the atmospheric outcome, actually. The second is insetting, which is to say that we spent a lot of time at Frontier lately looking at approaches to permanently remove carbon removal that utilize alkaline feedstocks specifically, and that could be steel slag, mine tailings, other kinds of industrial waste. And to date, many of the companies who produce these things haven't yet thought of them as potential assets to bring to bear to remove carbon from the atmosphere, and I think that's a really exciting possibility. And then the third is we can all fight about how to use the revenue from a border adjustment, and one potential use of such revenue, of course, would be investing in high-quality permanent carbon removal that may in fact be critical to fully decarbonize the industrial sector, some of the emissions from which are going to be very expensive to mitigate.
Awesome. Dave, you were on the National Security Council. How can we leverage a border carbon adjustment policy to secure US supply chains? I'll plug now, BPC has a critical minerals report coming out on this topic tomorrow, so check that out. Yeah, how can we bolster these supply chains?
Well, this is pretty fast. Look, I mean, I don't see Republicans supporting a U.S. CBAM policy design that doesn't do that, right? Because I think that's clearly one of the primary sort of objectives, for Republicans, and I think for Democrats too, but certainly for Republicans. And look, I mean, if we create a design that actually rewards emissions, environmental performance, okay, we're going to see greater investments and accelerated investments in manufacturing and in extraction and other activities here in the United States. So just because, I mean, as we discussed before, as Katrina laid out, and other folks have done so as well, just given our relative carbon efficiency, okay? But I will say this, the last thing I'll say related to this is that if you don't have permitting reform, right, if we can't actually build stuff here and get it permitted, then all these, the trade benefits, the potential trade benefits we're talking about just aren't there. There will be some, but we'll not get the benefits that we're talking about and emissions reductions that we're also talking about.
Yeah, thank you for plugging permitting.
Because you got permitting thing at BPC too.
Report, yeah, check out BPC's website for more permitting reports. I also want to touch on, the European Union has the CBAM coming into place in the next couple of years. Japan, South Korea, and Singapore have all thought about implementing one of these type of policies. I feel like this international trade pressure might make this more of a priority for Congress, but I want to ask y'all and really throw this out there, what is the US giving up by responding to these international trade pressures rather than getting out in front?
You can be a system maker or system taker, and generally the world's better off, and we're better off when we make the system. The EU is extremely good at doing this. They're extremely good at creating their own rules in relative secret and then propagating them all over the world in order to, with scalpel-like precision, promote their exports, promote their industries, promote their tax base in this case. But CBAM, let's be honest, I'm grateful to the EU for their for this opening effort. It's created a lot of ambition around the world, but it's a deeply flawed policy. And this creates an opening for us in turn to come up with something better and do right alongside our partners. Now, I'm not sure we really care in the United States because we do know that for the most part, the US is going to be a beneficiary of the CBAM. But I do think we need a policy against these sort of bad BAMs, as I call them, because we will need our own policy in order to provide the legal basis to defend against bad policies as they emerge. And if you don't have your own policy, it's very hard to go to trade court and say, you know, we're really mad about this policy, and they're doing it wrong, it has effectiveness issues, they've impinged on my right to regulate when I myself am not regulating in the space, right? So having your own policy really creates the foundation for your defensibility and that sort of legal basis.
It also gives you political leverage if you actually have a bill on the table that you can use to talk about the reality of what might happen, especially when you're trying to negotiate good BAMs or climate clubs or anything of that sort. Yeah.
Sounds like a song.
Yeah, I can see a report title in the making.
It reminds me of my kids like Flintstone vitamins.
Yeah, yeah.
Bam Bams.
So, and here's just a fact, right? I mean, neither the United States nor any developed economy has the market power alone to force China or wrest control of global supply chains away from China, period. And if we don't figure out how to develop, back to your point, like a US-led system, we can't work things out with the Europeans up front. We got to be able to work with the Koreans and the Aussies and the Japanese to come up with our system and then get the Europeans to play ball with us. You know, and a lot of my Republican friends, look, Republicans don't like the EU very much. I think Democrats like the EU more than we do, and that's okay. That's okay. Maybe you're.
You don't know. Hot take.
I'm
Here's the hot take. But let's just be honest. I mean, we have to figure things out with Europe because we can't achieve our geopolitical and commercial goals without some kind of meeting of minds with the European Union. Whether we like it or not, that's just the way it is. And I think the importance of the climate piece with trade is that, and a lot of folks, Republicans would say, look, climate activism is a religion in Europe. Well, I don't think you get Europe on board a common approach with us vis-a-vis China and trade without the climate piece.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's clear to me that there's a lot of bipartisan convergence, but also a lot of technical details we're going to need to work out here. So please give a round of applause to our great panelists.